shortly before 2 a.m. On November 13th, 1942, in the dark waters between Guadalcanal and the small volcanic island of Savo, one of the most violent naval clashes of the Pacific War was about to unfold. An American heavy cruiser and a Japanese battleship were firing directly at each other in the darkness. The distance between them was so close that the crews on both ships could have heard each other across the water. There was no room left for careful maneuvering, no perfect strategy, no time to retreat. The two fleets had collided head-on. More than 24 warships were now trapped in a deadly space only a few thousand yards wide, firing at every shape that appeared through the darkness. Explosions tore through the night. Gun flashes briefly revealed burning ships. Sometimes sailors were firing at enemy vessels. Sometimes, in the confusion, they were firing at their own side. One American officer who survived the battle later described it as a barroom fight with the lights knocked out. That description captured the chaos perfectly, because inside that darkness, the United States Navy had sent a force that was painfully outmatched. 5 cruisers, 8 destroyers, and standing in their path were 2 powerful Japanese battleships. The American ships were never meant to fight a battle like this. Their armor was weaker. Their guns were smaller. Against battleships, they were fighting a battle they were never expected to win, but they had no choice. Behind those Japanese battleships was the true target, Henderson Field, the airfield that kept the American forces alive on Guadalcanal. If those battleships reached their position and destroyed the airfield before sunrise, the entire American defense of the island could collapse. This was the naval battle of Guadalcanal, the climax of a campaign that had transformed the waters around the Solomon Islands into one of the most dangerous naval battlefields on Earth. For 3 nights in November 1942, Japan launched its greatest and final attempt to retake Guadalcanal. The plan was simple. First, 2 battleships would approach under the cover of darkness and destroy Henderson Field with their massive guns. Then, behind them, 11 transport ships carrying around 7,000 Japanese soldiers would arrive. Those troops were supposed to land, reinforce the exhausted Japanese forces already on the island, and overwhelm the American defenders. The battleships were the hammer. The transports were the army that would finish the job. But the operation would become one of Japan's greatest naval disasters of the war. The 2 battleships sent to destroy Henderson Field would end up at the bottom of the Pacific. The airfield would survive. And the thousands of soldiers sent to save Guadalcanal would never arrive as a fighting force. Many would die before they ever fired a shot. Their ships would be hunted down and destroyed. The men who survived the sinking would crawl onto the island with almost nothing except the clothes on their backs. It was a devastating defeat for Japan. But this was not a simple victory story, because the United States paid an enormous price for stopping the Japanese advance. 2 American admirals were killed in the same battle. A cruiser was lost with almost its entire crew, and among those lost were 5 brothers from the same family. This is the story of the 3 nights that decided the fate of Guadalcanal, the story of Japan's final desperate gamble, and the story of the American sailors who sacrificed everything to stop it. But to understand why both navies were willing to throw their ships into a deadly battle in the darkness, we first have to understand what Guadalcanal was really about, because the fight was never simply for the island itself. It was for a single strip of land. A simple airfield, Henderson Field. By November 1942, the battle for Guadalcanal had already been raging for 3 months, and the campaign had settled into a brutal pattern. During the day, American aircraft controlled the surrounding waters. At night, the Japanese Navy ruled the sea. The Americans had captured the unfinished airfield early in the campaign and renamed it Henderson Field. As long as they controlled it and kept aircraft operating from its runway, they could dominate the waters around Guadalcanal during daylight. The aircraft based there became known collectively as the Cactus Air Force, named after Guadalcanal's Allied code name. They were exhausted machines. They operated from a damaged airfield. They were constantly repaired after bombing attacks. The pilots and ground crews fought every day simply to keep the aircraft flying. But despite all of that, they became one of the main reasons the American position on Guadalcanal survived. Any Japanese ship caught within range of those aircraft during daylight was in serious danger. That single fact shaped the entire campaign. Japan could not simply send a massive fleet toward Guadalcanal in broad daylight. Their ships would be attacked before they ever reached the island. Their movements had to happen at night. They had only a few hours to strike, unload troops, and escape before sunrise. Because when the sun came up, Henderson Field came alive, and the sea belonged to America. But at night, everything changed. The darkness belonged to Japan. The Japanese Navy had spent years preparing for night surface combat. Their crews trained relentlessly to fight after sunset. They developed tactics designed specifically for attacking enemy ships in darkness. And they possessed a weapon that gave them a terrifying advantage: the Type 93 torpedo, known by Americans as the Long Lance. It was one of the most advanced torpedoes of the Second World War. It could travel farther, move faster, carry a larger explosive charge, and it left almost no visible trail behind it. A Japanese destroyer could launch these torpedoes from a great distance in the darkness. Often, the target had no warning until the explosion ripped through the ship. Combined with years of training in night fighting and precise maneuvering, this made the Japanese Navy the most dangerous surface fleet in the world after dark. American sailors had learned to fear the black waters around the Solomon Islands. The war around Guadalcanal became a battle against time. During daylight, America attempted to send supplies and reinforcements. During the night, Japanese ships raced down the narrow waters between the Solomon Islands, a route American sailors called the Tokyo Express. They delivered troops, ammunition, and supplies before turning away before dawn. Neither side could deliver the final blow. America could not completely stop the Japanese night runs. Japan could not destroy Henderson Field. And so the waters around Guadalcanal slowly filled with the wreckage of ships from both nations. By the end of the campaign, sailors had given that stretch of ocean a grim name: Iron Bottom Sound, a place where American and Japanese ships rested together beneath the waves. A name earned through blood. And by November 1942, the stage was set for Japan's largest attempt yet to change the outcome of the battle. By the middle of November 1942, the Japanese High Command had reached a critical decision. The slow battle for Guadalcanal could not continue forever. For 3 months, both sides had been fighting a war of exhaustion. Japan would send reinforcements one week, America would send reinforcements the next. Thousands of men were trapped on the island, suffering from hunger, disease, and constant combat. The American Marines held a shrinking defensive perimeter around Henderson Field. The Japanese soldiers deep in the jungle were slowly being weakened by starvation and exhaustion. Both armies were surviving on whatever supplies their navies could push through. But every convoy sent toward Guadalcanal came with a terrible risk. The sea between the island and the rest of the Solomon Islands had become a killing ground. Every ship that attempted to bring supplies paid a price. The Japanese leadership realized that small attacks would never solve the problem. They needed one final, massive operation. Guadalcanal had to be won completely, or abandoned. They chose one last attempt. The plan created in November 1942 was the largest Japanese operation since the campaign began. This time, Japan would not send another small group of destroyers through the night. This time, they would send battleships. The operation would be built around two powerful fast battleships, Hiei and Kirishima. Their mission was clear. Approach Guadalcanal during the night, reach the waters near Henderson Field, and destroy the airfield before sunrise. Their massive guns were capable of causing destruction unlike anything the Americans on the island had faced before. The battleships carried 8 14-inch guns each. These weapons could fire enormous shells over many miles. For this mission, however, they were not loaded with normal armor-piercing ammunition. Instead, they carried special high-explosive bombardment shells. These shells were designed to destroy an airfield. They could spread fire across large areas. They could damage aircraft parked on the ground. They could kill exposed personnel. A single bombardment could turn Henderson Field into a burning wasteland. But those special shells created a dangerous weakness. They were designed to destroy land targets, not enemy warships. They were not the best ammunition for a sudden battleship duel. The Japanese battleships were perfectly prepared to destroy an airfield. But they were less prepared for a close-range naval fight. And that was exactly the kind of fight they were about to enter. Because behind the battleships came the real objective: 11 transport ships, packed with around 7,000 soldiers. These were not simply reinforcements. They represented Japan's final attempt to change the balance of power on Guadalcanal. The soldiers carried weapons, ammunition, food, and equipment. They were supposed to land after Henderson Field had been destroyed. Once ashore, they would attack the exhausted American defenders and finally retake the island. The battleships were the hammer. The transports were the force that would finish the battle. Everything depended on one thing: Henderson Field had to stop flying. The Japanese knew exactly what was at stake. If the airfield survived another night, the transports would have to face American aircraft during daylight. And that meant disaster. The Americans also knew something was coming. Reconnaissance aircraft had detected Japanese movements. American commanders understood what a Japanese battleship bombardment would mean. There was almost nothing on Guadalcanal capable of stopping those ships. No powerful coastal defenses, no massive artillery batteries, no fortress. Only Henderson Field and the aircraft operating from it. If those aircraft were destroyed before morning, the Americans would lose control of the sea. And once that happened, the Japanese transports would arrive. The island could fall within days. Something had to stop the battleships before they reached firing position. But the force available to stop them was not a battleship fleet. It was a collection of cruisers and destroyers, ships that were never designed to fight battleships directly. The officer given this impossible mission was Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan. His force consisted of 13 ships, 5 cruisers, 8 destroyers, not a single battleship among them. On paper, the odds were terrible. A cruiser's guns could damage another cruiser, but against a battleship's armored belt, their shells had limited effect. A battleship's guns, however, could destroy a cruiser with devastating force. The Americans were sending smaller ships against larger ones. They were being asked to stop the most powerful warships in the Japanese fleet by sacrificing themselves. There was no perfect tactic, no easy solution, only one brutal option: get close, fight hard, and do enough damage before being destroyed. Admiral Callahan understood the danger. So did every sailor who entered Iron Bottom Sound that night. They knew the mathematics. They knew the difference between their ships and the Japanese battleships waiting ahead. But they also knew what would happen if they failed. Behind the Japanese battleships was an army. Behind that army was the future of Guadalcanal. So they sailed forward, into the darkness, into the danger, and into one of the most chaotic naval battles of the entire Second World War. Callahan did have one advantage. Some of his ships carried the newest American radar equipment. Radar could detect enemy ships in darkness before human eyes could see them. It offered something incredibly valuable, the ability to strike first. But that advantage was not used effectively. The radar-equipped ships were placed in the middle and rear of the American formation instead of leading the column. The information they gathered was not quickly delivered to the ships that needed it most. The Americans entered the battle without a clear picture of where the enemy was. They were sailing almost blind. The fleet moved forward in a long single column, a formation that would later be criticized by historians and naval officers. It was simple. It was easier for ships to follow. But in a night battle filled with confusion, it created serious problems. Each ship would enter danger one after another. Communication would become almost impossible. Once the shooting started, there would be no clean way to control the battle. A weaker fleet was moving into darkness. A stronger enemy was waiting. And the fate of Guadalcanal depended on what happened next. Shortly after 1 a.m. On November 13, 1942, the two fleets finally found each other. What happened next was not a traditional naval battle. It was a collision. The carefully prepared plans of both sides disappeared almost instantly. The American formation and the Japanese formation crashed together in the darkness, turning the waters around Guadalcanal into a scene of complete confusion. The range between the ships became unbelievably short. Thousands of yards became hundreds. Warships that were supposed to fight from a distance were suddenly surrounded by enemy vessels close enough to see the flashes from their guns. In the darkness, nobody had a complete picture of what was happening. Ships struggled to identify friend from enemy. A vessel could appear as a target one moment and disappear into the night the next. By the time a ship was recognized, someone was already firing. The battle became exactly what one survivor later described, a barroom fight with the lights knocked out. American and Japanese ships were mixed together in the same small area of ocean. Shells crossed through the darkness. Torpedoes raced in every direction. Searchlights cut through the night, but the moment a ship turned on its lights, it became a target. The ocean itself became a battlefield of fire and destruction. Some ships fired at targets only a few hundred yards away. Others were forced into situations no naval commander would ever choose. A destroyer could find itself directly beside a battleship. The battleship's huge guns were sometimes unable to lower enough to hit the smaller ship at such close range. The destroyer, however, could fire everything it had into the enemy's exposed areas. The smallest ships in the American force showed extraordinary courage. They charged toward the Japanese battleships. They moved into danger because they had no other choice. Their mission was not to win a fair fight. Their mission was to delay the enemy long enough for Henderson Field to survive. American destroyers launched torpedoes from dangerously close distances. They fired their smaller guns at enormous enemy ships. They attacked even when they knew they were vulnerable. Several of these destroyers paid the ultimate price. Some were destroyed by Japanese gunfire. Others were torn apart by torpedoes. Many sailors entered the burning waters of Iron Bottom Sound. But their sacrifice created something important. Chaos. The Japanese battleships had planned to calmly approach Henderson Field, destroy the airfield, and withdraw before sunrise. Instead, they were dragged into a violent close-range battle where confusion replaced strategy. The American ships were buying time, and every minute mattered. At the center of the battle was Admiral Daniel Callahan's flagship, the heavy cruiser San Francisco. Inside the chaos, the San Francisco found herself facing the Japanese battleship Hiei at extremely close range. The Japanese battleship opened fire. The results were devastating. Heavy shells smashed into the American cruiser's bridge. The command area was destroyed. In a single terrible moment, Admiral Callahan and many members of his staff were killed. The American force had lost its commander in the middle of the battle. But Callahan was not the only senior officer lost that night. Aboard the light cruiser Atlanta was another American admiral, Rear Admiral Norman Scott. Scott was one of the few American commanders who already had experience winning a night battle around Guadalcanal. Only weeks earlier, he had achieved victory at the Battle of Cape Esperance. Now he was fighting in another deadly nighttime engagement. The Atlanta was positioned near the front of the American formation. Almost immediately, she became trapped in the chaos. She was struck repeatedly. Shells ripped through the ship. Some damage may have come from confused American fire, as ships struggled to identify targets. And in the middle of that destruction, Admiral Scott was killed on his bridge. Within minutes of each other, the United States Navy lost 2 admirals in the same surface engagement. It was an extraordinary moment in American naval history. Admiral Daniel Callahan, Admiral Norman Scott. Both were killed in the same narrow stretch of burning ocean. Both would later receive the Medal of Honor for their actions. Their deaths showed just how brutal this battle had become. In normal circumstances, admirals were among the most protected men in a fleet. They were supposed to command from positions of safety. But Guadalcanal was not a normal battle. The distances were too close. The fire was too intense. The darkness was too complete. There was no safe place. Officers and ordinary sailors died together. The same shells that destroyed ships destroyed the men commanding them. And the cost to the American fleet continued to rise. The cruiser Atlanta was damaged beyond repair and later abandoned. Several destroyers were sunk. The Cushing, the Laffey, the Barton, the Monson. Some were destroyed by Japanese gunfire. Others were struck by the deadly long-lance torpedoes that had made the Japanese Navy so feared at night. The American losses were severe. By the normal measurement of naval warfare, ships lost and sailors killed, Japan had won the battle. But Guadalcanal was not decided by normal measurements, because in the middle of all that destruction, the American force had achieved the one objective that mattered. They had stopped the Japanese battleships. They had placed themselves between the enemy and Henderson Field. They had refused to let Japan pass. And one Japanese battleship had suffered serious damage. The Hiei. During the close-range battle, American shells repeatedly struck the Japanese battleship. The armor protecting its main hull was strong enough to resist many cruiser shells. But the upper structures of the ship were vulnerable. The American ships fired again and again at close range. They damaged the battleship's superstructure. They damaged its steering. They started fires. One hit alone was not enough. But dozens of hits combined into a deadly result. The Hiei was badly wounded. When daylight approached on November 13, the Japanese battleship was still afloat. But it was crippled, and daylight was the worst possible thing that could happen to a damaged Japanese ship near Guadalcanal, because daylight brought Henderson Field back to life. The airfield that Japan had come to destroy was still operating. Its aircraft took off. They found the damaged Hie, and they attacked. The Japanese battleship that had helped destroy the American cruiser force was now trapped. It could not escape. It could not effectively defend itself against repeated air attacks. Throughout the day, American aircraft continued striking the ship. Eventually, the crew abandoned the battleship. The Hie was scuttled and became the first Japanese battleship lost during the Second World War. Japan had sent a battleship to destroy Henderson Field. Instead, Henderson Field helped destroy that battleship. The weapon Japan feared most had survived. The airfield was still alive. And as long as Henderson Field remained operational, Japanese ships in the waters around Guadalcanal were never safe. The first night ended with both sides suffering enormous losses. The American force was shattered. 2 admirals were dead. Several ships were lost. But the Japanese bombardment had failed. Henderson Field survived. And one of Japan's most powerful battleships was dying because it had failed to destroy it. But the battle was far from over. Japan still had another battleship, the Kirishima, and behind it was the transport fleet carrying thousands of soldiers who were still waiting to invade Guadalcanal. The first night of the Guadalcanal naval battle had ended. But the cost was still being counted. American ships that survived the fighting were damaged, burning, and struggling to stay together. Many of them turned away from Guadalcanal and began the difficult journey toward repair. Among those ships was the light cruiser US Juno. The Juno had already suffered damage during the night battle. She had been struck by a Japanese torpedo and was moving slowly through the water with the other surviving American ships. For the sailors aboard, the battle seemed to be over. They had survived the chaos. They had escaped the darkness. They were finally heading away from the killing zone. But the Pacific Ocean was not finished with them. On the morning of November 13, while the damaged American ships were withdrawing, a Japanese submarine found their formation. The submarine was I-26. It moved into position and launched a spread of torpedoes. One of those torpedoes struck the US Juno, and it hit the cruiser in the worst possible place. The explosion reached the ship's ammunition storage area. The result was catastrophic. The Juno did not slowly sink. She exploded. A massive blast tore through the ship, breaking her apart in seconds. The cruiser disappeared beneath the waves in less than half a minute. The other American ships saw the explosion, but they were damaged themselves. They feared more submarine attacks. And in the confusion of the retreat, they believed there could be no survivors. So they continued moving. They were wrong. There were survivors. More than 100 men had somehow survived the explosion. They were now alone in the open Pacific. They clung to pieces of wreckage and life rafts, watching the ships that had been fighting beside them disappear over the horizon. They waited for rescue. But rescue did not come. What followed became one of the most tragic episodes of the entire Guadalcanal campaign. For days, the survivors of the Juno remained in the water. They suffered from wounds. They suffered from thirst. They suffered from exposure under the brutal Pacific sun. Some died from exhaustion. Others were taken by sharks. The men who had survived the destruction of their ship now faced a different enemy, time. Of the nearly 700 sailors aboard US Juno, only 10 survived. The rest were lost. Some died in the explosion. Many died afterward, while still alive in the water, waiting for help that never arrived. That was the cruelest part of the tragedy. They had survived the sinking. They had escaped the ship. They were wounded but alive. They only needed someone to find them. But delays, confusion, and communication failures meant that the rescue effort came too late. Day after day passed. The Pacific Ocean slowly took the remaining survivors. Among those lost were 5 brothers. The Sullivan brothers, George, Francis, Joseph, Madison, and Albert Sullivan, were 5 sons from Waterloo, Iowa. They had joined the Navy after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Their close friend had been killed during that attack, and they wanted to serve their country. But they had one condition. They wanted to serve together. All 5 brothers believed that if they were going to fight, they would fight side by side. The Navy normally tried to separate brothers serving in the military. The reason was simple. A single disaster could destroy an entire family. But the Sullivan brothers insisted. They wanted to remain together. Their request was accepted. The 5 brothers, aged between 20 and 27, went to war together. They served together aboard US Juno, and they were aboard her during the night she disappeared beneath the Pacific. 4 of the brothers were lost when the ship exploded and sank. The 5th brother, George, survived the initial destruction. He reached the water. He survived for several days. But eventually, he died before rescue arrived. All 5 brothers were gone. One family had lost every son in a single disaster. The news shocked the United States. The country had already experienced enormous losses during the war. But the story of 5 brothers from one family dying together created a level of grief that was difficult to describe. Their parents, Thomas and Aleta Sullivan, had sent 5 sons into the war. They never came home. The story became one of the most powerful symbols of sacrifice during World War II. It gave a human face to the enormous cost of the war, being fought thousands of miles away. The loss of the Sullivan brothers also changed military policy. After the tragedy, the United States military moved toward stronger protections designed to prevent multiple siblings from being placed in the same dangerous situation. This became known as the sole survivor policy. The sacrifice of one family helped protect others in future conflicts. But while America mourned the loss of US Juno and the Sullivan brothers, the battle for Guadalcanal was still not finished. Japan had failed on the first night. The Hiei was gone. Henderson Field was still operating. But Japan still had another battleship, the Kirishima, and behind it were the transport ships carrying thousands of soldiers. Japan was not ready to give up. The second night would bring a different kind of battle. This time, the Americans would not send cruisers and destroyers against battleships. This time, they would send battleships of their own. The decision was dangerous, almost unbelievable. But it came from desperation. The American commander in the South Pacific, Admiral William Halsey, had very few options left. The first night had destroyed much of America's cruiser force. Several ships were lost. Many others needed repairs. American aircraft carriers were damaged or unavailable. But 2 powerful battleships remained. US Washington and US South Dakota. These ships had originally been serving as protection for aircraft carriers. The traditional thinking of naval warfare at the time considered battleships too valuable to risk in dangerous nighttime battles, especially against a Japanese navy that had dominated night combat for months. But Halsey believed Guadalcanal was worth the risk. He needed something powerful enough to stop the Kirishima, and only battleships could fight battleships. So he made a decision. He would gamble 2 of the most valuable ships in the American fleet. They would enter Iron Bottom Sound, and they would face Japan in the darkness once again. When Admiral William Halsey made the decision to send battleships into Iron Bottom Sound, he understood exactly what he was risking. The Japanese Navy had spent years mastering nighttime naval combat. They had built their reputation in the darkness. They had destroyed American ships with their superior training, their tactics, and their deadly long-lance torpedoes. Now America was sending two of its most valuable battleships directly into that darkness. But Halsey had reached a simple conclusion. If Japan's battleships were allowed to reach Henderson Field, the airfield would be destroyed. And if Henderson Field fell silent, Guadalcanal could be lost. The risk was enormous. But the alternative was worse. The two battleships chosen for the mission were US Washington and US South Dakota. They would operate under the command of Rear Admiral Willis Lee. Unlike many naval officers of the time, Lee understood the potential of radar better than almost anyone else in the American fleet. He knew that radar could change the nature of night combat. For months, Japan had owned the darkness, but now America had a tool that could challenge that advantage. The second night of the battle would be different. The Americans would not stumble blindly into the enemy. They would hunt. On the night of November 14th, 15th, 1942, the American force entered Iron Bottom Sound. Along with Washington and South Dakota were several destroyers. Their mission was simple: find the Japanese battleship Kirishima, stop it from reaching Henderson Field. The Japanese force approaching Guadalcanal was still powerful. The Kirishima was accompanied by heavy cruisers and destroyers. They were confident. They believed they could complete what the Hiei had failed to do. Destroy the airfield, open the way for the transport fleet, and finally bring enough troops to overwhelm the Americans. But the situation had changed. The Americans had learned from the first night. And this time, they were not sending smaller ships into a fight they could not win. They were sending battleships. The two fleets moved through the darkness, searching for each other. Then, the battle began. At first, the fighting appeared to repeat the chaos of the previous night. American destroyers moved forward to attack. But once again, they paid a terrible price. The smaller ships entered the danger zone first. They faced enemy fire from larger Japanese vessels. Several destroyers were badly damaged. The American screen was broken apart. Then the battle turned toward the two battleships. The US South Dakota soon faced serious problems. During the fight, an electrical failure affected many of the ship's systems. The damage was severe. The battleship lost important equipment at exactly the moment it needed it most. Her radar effectiveness was reduced. Her ability to communicate was affected. And suddenly, one of America's strongest ships was struggling in the middle of the battle. The situation became even worse. The Japanese discovered the South Dakota. Searchlights cut through the darkness and illuminated the American battleship. For a moment, the South Dakota became the center of the entire battle. Japanese guns opened fire. Shells struck the battleship again and again. The damage was frightening. Her upper structures were hit. Her crew suffered casualties. For a time, it appeared that the South Dakota might be destroyed. But while the Japanese focused everything on the burning American battleship, another ship remained hidden. US Washington. Admiral Willis Lee had kept Washington silent. He had not revealed his position. He waited. And he trusted his radar. This was the moment radar was designed for. In the darkness, Washington could see what human eyes could not. The Japanese battleship Kirishima. The Japanese believed they were fighting the South Dakota. They did not realize another American battleship was watching from the darkness. Then, Washington opened fire. The result was devastating. At close range, US Washington unleashed her main battery against Kirishima. Her 16-inch guns fired massive armor-piercing shells. Each shell weighed more than a small vehicle. Each one carried enough power to destroy heavily armored targets. The Japanese battleship had almost no time to react. Washington's radar-guided fire was accurate. The shells struck again and again. The Kirishima was being destroyed by an enemy ship she could barely see. The Japanese battleship attempted to respond, but she could not find the Washington. She fired toward the burning South Dakota. She fired into the darkness. But the real threat remained hidden. The difference between the two navies was now clear. Japan had dominated night fighting for months. But technology had changed the battlefield. Radar had given America the ability to see first, and in naval warfare, seeing first could mean survival. Within minutes, the Kirishima suffered catastrophic damage. Her steering system was destroyed. Her hull was damaged. Fires spread throughout the ship. The once powerful battleship had become a burning wreck. After the battle, the crew abandoned the Kirishima. The second Japanese battleship sent to destroy Henderson Field was gone. 2 nights, 2 battleships, both lost. Japan had spent its greatest naval weapons trying to silence one airfield, but Henderson Field was still alive. Its aircraft were still flying. And the transport fleet waiting behind the battleships was now exposed. The Americans had paid heavily. Destroyers had been lost. The South Dakota had been badly damaged. Many sailors had died, but the strategic result was clear. The Japanese bombardment had failed. Again, the Kirishima had been sent to open the way. Instead, it became another ship resting beneath the waters of Iron Bottom Sound. Now only one question remained. What would happen to the Japanese transport fleet carrying 7,000 soldiers toward Guadalcanal? Without battleship protection, they were moving directly into American-controlled daylight waters. And daylight was coming. The destruction of the Kirishima ended Japan's last attempt to destroy Henderson Field with battleships. But the operation itself was not finished. The Japanese transport fleet was still moving toward Guadalcanal. 11 transport ships. Around 7,000 soldiers. Thousands of men who had crossed the Pacific believing they were about to land on the island and change the course of the campaign. They had been promised victory. They had been told the battleships would clear the way. They had been told Henderson Field would be destroyed. But when the morning came, the reality was completely different. The Japanese battleships were gone. The airfield was still alive. And the American aircraft that Japan had desperately tried to eliminate was still operating. The entire purpose of the operation had failed. The transport fleet was now sailing into a trap. The Japanese commander of the convoy understood the danger. He knew that without battleship protection, his ships were extremely vulnerable. Transport vessels were not designed to survive heavy attacks. They carried soldiers, supplies, and equipment. They were slow. They were lightly protected. And now they were entering waters controlled by American aircraft. But turning back was almost impossible. Thousands of soldiers depended on those ships. The Japanese command had committed everything to this operation. If the convoy returned without landing, Guadalcanal would remain in American hands. So the transports continued forward. They sailed directly toward the island, toward the airfield that had survived 2 battleship attacks, toward the aircraft that were waiting for daylight. And when the sun rose, the Pacific sky became filled with American aircraft. Planes from Henderson Field launched into action. Bombers, fighters, attack aircraft. The same airfield Japan had tried so desperately to destroy now became the weapon that destroyed the Japanese invasion force. The transports had almost no chance. They had no battleships protecting them. No powerful naval guns. No way to fight back against repeated air attacks. One after another, Japanese transports were hit. Bombs struck their decks. Fires spread across the ships. Some vessels sank into the ocean. Others reached the shoreline only to be destroyed where they landed. The disaster unfolded in full daylight. Thousands of Japanese soldiers were trapped inside burning ships. They were not fighting an enemy army. They were trapped inside transport vessels under attack from the sky. They had rifles. They had equipment. They had prepared for a ground battle. But they had no defense against aircraft attacking from above. For many soldiers, the first battlefield they experienced was the burning deck of a sinking ship. As the transports went down, hundreds of men entered the water. Many were unable to swim. Their heavy equipment pulled them beneath the surface. The ocean became filled with struggling soldiers surrounded by burning fuel and wreckage. It was one of the most complete defeats of the Pacific War. An entire army was destroyed before it could even reach the battlefield. Japan had not lost these soldiers during a desperate attack against American defenses. It had lost them before they could even fight. The transport fleet had been sent to save Guadalcanal. Instead, it became a graveyard. Of the 11 transports that began the journey, only a few managed to reach the island. But even those ships were destroyed or damaged beyond usefulness. The soldiers who reached shore arrived without the equipment they needed. Their weapons were limited. Their ammunition was gone. Their food supplies had disappeared beneath the waves. They were no longer a powerful reinforcement force. They were survivors. The Japanese army that was supposed to change the balance on Guadalcanal had effectively been destroyed before firing a meaningful shot. The disaster was complete. Japan had gambled everything on one operation. 2 battleships, 11 transports, thousands of soldiers. And almost all of it was lost. The battle for Guadalcanal had reached its turning point. The reasons for Japan's defeat were now clear. The first was the sacrifice of Admiral Callaghan's force. His ships were destroyed. His admirals were killed. But they achieved the most important objective. They stopped the first bombardment. If the Japanese battleships had reached Henderson Field that night, history might have been very different. The weaker American force had paid with its own destruction to buy the time needed for victory. The second reason was Henderson Field itself. The entire Japanese operation depended on destroying that airfield. But they never succeeded. The airfield survived. Its aircraft survived, and those aircraft destroyed the Japanese transports that were supposed to save the island. The third reason was technology. Radar. During the first night, America had failed to fully use its radar advantage. During the second night, Admiral Willis Lee used it perfectly. Washington remained hidden in the darkness and destroyed the Kirishima with radar-directed gunfire. The balance of nighttime naval warfare had changed. Japan had dominated the darkness. But now, America had learned how to fight there. The fourth reason was the size of Japan's gamble. Japan committed almost everything to one final operation. 2 battleships, an entire division of soldiers, a major transport fleet. When that operation failed, it failed completely. There was no backup plan, no second force waiting behind it. No easy recovery. Japan had sent its battleships to open the door. It had sent its army to walk through. But the door was never opened, and the army drowned before reaching the battlefield. The 3 nights of fighting around Guadalcanal had changed everything. Japan had launched its greatest effort to retake the island. It had sent its strongest ships. It had sent thousands of soldiers. It had risked everything on one final operation. And it had lost almost everything. The battleships were gone. The transport fleet was destroyed. The army meant to save Guadalcanal had been broken before it could even reach the battlefield. The island that Japan had fought so desperately to reclaim remained in American hands. But the victory came with a terrible cost. The United States had won the battle. But it had not escaped the suffering. The price had been paid by the sailors who entered Iron Bottom Sound, knowing they might never return. It was paid by Admiral Daniel Callaghan and Admiral Norman Scott, who died leading their men. It was paid by the crews of the destroyed cruisers and destroyers, and it was paid by the sailors of Us Juno, including 5 brothers whose names would become a symbol of sacrifice. The battle for Guadalcanal was not simply a story of ships sinking beneath the waves. It was a story of people, young men who entered a war thousands of miles from home. Men who fought in darkness. Men who continued forward even when the odds were against them. The 5 Sullivan brothers became one of the most remembered examples of that sacrifice. Their loss changed the way the American military handled families serving together. The country had lost 5 sons from one household, a tragedy so powerful that it changed military policy for generations. The names George, Francis, Joseph, Madison, and Albert Sullivan would not be forgotten. Their story lived on through the Sullivans, a Navy ship named in their honor. A reminder that those 5 brothers who went to war together would, in a way, continue serving together. But beyond individual stories, the 3 nights in Iron Bottom Sound represented a major turning point in the Pacific War. Before Guadalcanal, Japan still held many advantages. Its navy was experienced. Its crews were highly trained. Its night fighting ability was feared throughout the Pacific. But Guadalcanal proved that Japan's advantage was not permanent. The United States Navy had learned. American crews adapted. American technology improved. And American industry was only beginning to show its true strength. The battle also revealed the growing importance of air power. Japan had sent battleships to destroy Henderson Field. But the airfield survived, and the aircraft operating from that simple strip of land destroyed the very fleet sent to eliminate it. The lesson was clear. Control of the sky controlled the sea. A single airfield had defeated battleships. And the future of naval warfare was changing. After the November battles, Japan never again attempted a major reinforcement operation of the same size to retake Guadalcanal. The cost had become too great. Every attempt to send supplies had ended with more ships lost, more men lost, more resources destroyed. The Japanese troops already on the island were now beyond rescue. They had expected reinforcements. They had expected supplies. Instead, they watched from the shore as the ships meant to save them burned on the horizon. The situation became desperate. Food disappeared. Disease spread. The soldiers who remained were weakened by hunger as much as by combat. Many survived only by eating whatever they could find. Roots, leaves, anything that kept them alive. Within months, Japan quietly evacuated the remaining survivors. Guadalcanal was abandoned. The island that had become a symbol of Japanese expansion had become the place where that expansion began to collapse. The 3 nights of November 1942 had decided the campaign. They had shown that Japan could no longer fight the United States with the same confidence it once had. The balance of power in the Pacific had begun to shift. Deep beneath the waters of Iron Bottom Sound, American and Japanese ships still remain. Cruisers, destroyers, battleships, the remains of a battle fought in darkness. They rest together in the same ocean that witnessed their destruction. The Atlanta, the Juno, the Hiei, the Kirishima, all became part of the underwater battlefield that gave Iron Bottom Sound its name. The naval battle of Guadalcanal was one of the most brutal naval struggles of the Second World War. It was a decisive American victory. But it was not an easy victory. It was bought with the lives of sailors who knew exactly what they were facing. A weaker force stood in front of a stronger enemy. 2 admirals gave their lives. A cruiser disappeared with hundreds of men. 5 brothers were lost together. And thousands of soldiers were sent to the bottom of the Pacific before they ever reached the battlefield. Japan had sent 7,000 men to save Guadalcanal. They never arrived as an army. The ships carrying them became their graves. And in those 3 terrible nights in November 1942, the United States Navy proved something that would shape the rest of the Pacific War. The Japanese Navy could be challenged. Even in the darkness, even at sea, even when the odds seemed impossible. That was the true meaning of Guadalcanal, not just a battle won, but a turning point, a moment when the direction of the war began to change. The waters of Iron Bottom Sound still remember what happened there. A victory, a tragedy, and the enormous human cost of war. This was the story of Guadalcanal. 3 nights that changed the Pacific War forever.